Hey everybody, it's me, Pete. Obviously, I'm not here in the flesh, but I'm with you in spirit. Kind of. I'm on vacation this week, taking some time off to see Noah perform down at Pepperdine in Malibu. On our way there, we're going to hang out a couple days at Yosemite, see some waterfalls. Should be awesome this time of year, and then hang out at the beach for a little bit. So if I don't look a little more relaxed when we get back, something is wrong with me. We're taking a look at a passage that should be music to the ears of a lot of people in our culture right now. It's from John chapter 15. I'll read it here in a second. It's about the vine and the branches. It's really poetic, a little bit scary if we think about it too much, but we'll unpack some of this and it'll make sense soon enough. We live in a time in history where a phrase has grown more and more common. It started to show up in the 1980s, early 1980s in force, and it is still with us today, and it is increasing. And that statement, as you've heard me say it around the church before in reference to this cultural shift, the phrase is, I'm spiritual but not religious. And what people are saying when they're saying that is they're making a statement about why, why they're not in church. And they're basically saying, don't judge me because I'm not in an organized religion. I'm still spiritual. And I think what this really has to say is a lot more about our time and our time in church history than it does about a person's character or faithfulness or connection to God or whatever. There's a historian, a church historian named Phyllis Tickle, and she wrote a book on historical changes happening in the church. And she said, and I think she's right, that about every 500 years or so in church history, or in history since they're kind of together, about every 500 years in history, the church goes through a yard sale experience where they take a look at what they have, what they've been offering, and they just kind of do a major purge of the things that aren't really working anymore or got a little wonky. Oftentimes they come under great struggle. In fact, they did. The last one that happened was the Reformation, which literally split the church in half. And you had Catholics and Protestants after that. And that caused bloodshed. It caused wars. It was a big mess. And I talked a little bit about that last week, parts of it anyway. Well, we're about at that 500-year mark right now. And there is a cataclysmic shift happening within the church about the way we think about the Bible, the way we think about God, the way we think about faith. Crosswalk is on the leading edge of that. We're not leading it, but we're on the front edge of this shift and trying to figure out what this thing looks like and what are we experiencing and what needs to change. And we've already gone through a lot of this process here at this church. A lot of it has to do with our theological orientation and the way we think about the Bible in particular. And that changes a lot of things about how we think about everything. Well, one of the issues that comes up with that then is how do we think about spirituality? If we all want to be spiritual and we all are spiritual, how do we play that out? What does it look like? And should we chuck everything that the church has to offer? And if we do, then what are we left with? Is it just simply our own hopeful thoughts? Or is there more to offer? Is there more to the story? Is there more to go after? That's what I want to talk about today, because Jesus, if we look at him as a great spiritual leader, at least, which he was, everybody agrees with that much, then maybe he has something to tell us about what this spirituality can look like, and how do we know if we're getting it, if we're nailing it. So that's what we're going to look at today, and there's going to be three different phases that we're going to look at today on how to have a spirituality that is alive and vital, connects you with God in healthy ways, as in the footsteps and tradition of Jesus. So, John 15, I'm reading the Message version, which I think really brings it home. We're going to look at the first 17 verses, and this is what it says. I am the real vine, and my Father is the farmer. He cuts off every branch of me that doesn't bear grapes. And every branch that is grape-bearing, he prunes back, so it will bear even more. You are already pruned back by the message I have spoken. Live in me. Make your home in me just as I do in you. In the same way that a branch can't bear grapes by itself, but only by being joined to the vine, you can't bear fruit unless you are joined with me. I am the vine, you are the branches. When you're joined with me and I with you, the relation intimate and organic. The harvest is sure to be abundant. I'm going to read that again because that's so important. I am the vine, you are the branches. When you're joined with me and I with you, the relation intimate and organic. The harvest is sure to be abundant. Separated, you can't produce a thing. Anyone who separates from me is dead wood, gathered up and thrown on the bonfire. But if you make yourselves at home with me and my words are at home in you, you can be sure that whatever you ask will be listened to and acted upon. This is how my Father shows who he is, when you produce grapes, when you mature as my disciples. I've loved you the way my Father has loved me. Make yourselves at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done, kept my Father's commands and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy, and your joy wholly mature. This is my command. Love one another the way I loved you. This is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. You are my friends when you do the things I command you. I'm no longer calling you servants, because servants don't understand that their master is thinking and planning. No, I've named you friends because I've let you in on everything. I've heard from the Father. You didn't choose me, remember. I chose you and put you in the world to bear fruit, fruit that won't spoil. As fruit bearers, ask whatever you ask the Father in relation to me, he gives you. But remember the root command, love one another. When I think of these verses from John chapter 15, I think about personal spiritual disciplines. And when I think about personal spiritual disciplines, I think about my grandpa, Peter Smith. He was a pastor for decades in Kansas and Iowa and Minnesota and even California. And I still remember him with great admiration to this day. I'm named after him, so that automatically scores some points in my book. He's got a good name. But he was remarkable in what he did with his personal devotional life. He would wake up at 5 a.m. every morning, grab some coffee because, of course, and he would sit down for an hour and go through a prayer list every day of his family, dear friends, prayer requests all over the nation and the world. And he devoted himself to prayer for at least a solid hour and some devotional reading and meditation. I was on that list. So while he was alive, he was literally praying for me every day. My own parents, by the way, have now adopted that same thing. And when I talk to them or they write us, they let us know they pray for us every day by name. My wife, myself, my kids, maybe even my dog, I don't know. But anyway, the point is that they're devoted in this kind of a way. And that kind of devotion on a daily basis makes a huge difference. I can't tell you how important that is. There are lots of different things you can do, lots of different spiritual practices you can do on your own that will help foster your relationship with God. There's stuff that we do here every week at Crosswalk, meditation, which involves deep breathing and maybe a centered kind of prayer, focusing on a word in that prayer that can draw you closer into the heart of God and give you a sense of peace that is lasting. Contemplation is similar to that. It's usually focused on a word or phrase for a little bit longer period of time, but often involves some of the same dynamics of deep breathing. There's other stuff you can do. There's devotional reading that I think is important. There's some people really geek out on worship music, so there's plenty of that out there, and you can dig into that and just soar into the heavens with whatever worship music is going on. I'm a nature nut, so I love to go and get out in the sticks and be among the trees or the beach or the mountains or whatever. To me, the Spirit of God is just screaming in nature. It can't help itself. So that's one way. Some people, it's acts of service, and you feel closest to God when your hands are getting dirty helping somebody else. Sometimes it's activism, so lending your voice to a cause that's really important connects you to God in some powerful way. Deep theological reading, or at least Christian literature type reading, All these things are really good and really important, and I hope you'll integrate them into your life. And I hope you'll discover some of these if you're not using any of these. There's probably some that are better for your personality type than others. Even in the way that you read the Bible, your personality type makes a difference. But the point of all that is to stay closer to God, to remain in the vine. That's the point. And if you don't exercise those things, just like having a gym membership doesn't make you fit, having your spiritual disciplines that you know are there but never practicing them isn't helping you any. So it's hard at times to get into a new rhythm, but I hope you'll pick up a habit of whatever's working for you, and it may change over time, but whatever's working for you, integrate it into your life. Probably earlier in the day rather than later in the day, is you're going to have better luck with it. So you can't get disturbed, but I highly recommend that you do that. But this verse is a lot more than just about figuring out how to have your personal devotional time. In fact, that's the least thing, and probably the least important thing for our culture, because our culture is already hyper-focused on personal spirituality. So it's not like we even need to say that. Everybody's already thinking about that, apparently, because everybody's saying they're spiritual but not religious, whatever that might mean. So let's talk about it at a little deeper context or deeper way of thinking about things. Here at Crosswalk, when we think about what it means to be in Jesus and Jesus in us, we think about what were the steps of Jesus that he took. So we've organized our ministry around our belief statement, which you can read on our website, and we think that if we organize ourselves around these particular movements, that we'll more likely find ourselves walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Every one of those movements is a choice, and every movement is directed toward our renewal, the resurrection of dead things in our life, for life at its fullness, its most vital, its deepest taproot into a spirituality that is the essence of God. So let me just run through these things with you, because you've probably heard these things before, but hey, why not tell them to you again? The first one has to do with stretching. And when Jesus shows up in John chapter 3, he's with Nicodemus, and he's blowing Nicodemus's mind. And Jesus himself was a lifelong learner. So the question for you is, how are you engaging in questions and study that is increasing your understanding and your capacity to know God? But I'm wondering what kind of questions you're asking, or somewhere along the line, did you forget to ask questions? Did you lose your curiosity? That's really what this whole stretch movement is about, is to recognize just how incredibly expansive God is, and to remain curious about who is God, what is the nature of God, how does this whole thing work, and then go after it, because there are people that are thinking about this stuff and having conversations about it. So the first movement is stretch, not the first as in order, but the first one I'm telling you about. The next one we see in Jesus' movement is he was known for mixing it up with people in healthy ways, just serving them in loving ways. And so we try to create ministry things around here that have to do with serving other people, kneeling. I'm here in the food pantry. That is an act of kneeling in service to our Napa community once a month. Shelves are getting a little bare now, but in a week from now, this place is going to be full. There's going to be a ton of food in here, and we're going to give it all away. I mean, that's our goal. Well, maybe not all of it, but pretty close. And that is an act of kneeling in service. So my question for you is, how are you kneeling in service to other people? Because that's a key part of staying in Jesus and Jesus in you. You're following in the footsteps. So first, we're talking about stretching our mind, being lifelong learners. Next, we're talking about serving other people. And the question is, how are you doing that? And the next one has to do with being a loving and forgiving presence in the world. Wherever Jesus went, when he came across people who felt marginalized by the rest of the culture, judged particularly by religious people, Jesus was always the voice of forgiveness and inclusion. How are you doing that? The movement that we call in our belief statement is that we will grace people. And so the question is how are you doing that? Are you intentionally thinking ways to live in a graceful way, which is a get-to thing? You know, we live in kind of a hypercritical culture that's hyper-focused on what people are doing wrong. I mean, our media has made a whole industry out of this thing about picking apart people and tearing them down as much as you can. Well, how can you be the opposite of that? And do you realize what a gift that is? All these things are get-to kinds of things. You get to stretch your learning. You get to stay curious. You get to serve other people and make their world better, which is incredible. And you get to be graceful. You get to be the voice of love and grace and forgiveness wherever you go. I mean, how amazing is that? So how are you waking up and starting your day imagining how you might be a graceful presence in someone else's life? Which leads us to the next thing, which we talked a lot about last week, which is, what does it mean to be spiritually infused people? The fancy word for that is incarnate. We look at Jesus as an example of Word made flesh, the Spirit of God dwelling in a human body. And what was true of Jesus is also true of us. We are infused with the very Spirit of God. You can't get rid of it. It's a part of it. It's a part of you. It's a part of me. Well, what are we doing with that? And how are we allowing that reality to take us closer in relationship to other people and their highs and lows? And so that's really what that one is about, is really listening to this voice, and in the relationships that we're in, wherever those might be, and seasons of joy like Mary anointing Jesus' feet, and Jesus being there fully with her and embodying it and embracing it, celebrating it, elevating her, Mary doing it as an act of incarnation, or times like at the Last Supper, where Jesus is around rude people who don't wash each other's feet when they know they should. A betrayer is at the table, a friend who's not going to be so friendly by the next morning. All these things together, we look at Jesus and we see an example of what it looks like to be incarnate. Even when he's on the cross, he acts with grace and mercy, because this is a reflection of the Spirit of God within him, living within him. And so that question for you is, how are you figuring out how to get to do this incarnate thing more fully? It's a curiosity thing, it's a learning thing, but also it's a paying attention thing and really owning what this incredible statement is. So the last thing we're going to look at is a part of this passage that our Western culture doesn't want to talk about or admit is even there. We like how it sounds pretty, but we don't actually know what to do with it. And that passage has to do with Jesus' new command. He says, I have a command for you, and that is to love one another. He goes on to say, not only do I want you to just love one another, I want you to love each other as I have loved you. And I think that's really important. I mentioned this several weeks ago. I'm sure you all remember. But I think it's a gift that Jesus gives to us to say, don't just love the way you think you ought to love, because you need a new model. You need a new way to think about loving. So don't just love one another any old way. Love one another as I have loved you. In other words, he's giving us an example of what that looks like, which he did with his whole life, which we've already talked about some right now. And engaging people and loving them where they are, as they are, unconditionally. That's what he was all about. So this cannot be done in isolation. And somehow in our country, we've got it into our head that we can do everything all by ourselves. But I want to tell you, the gospel and faith entirely is not a me, myself, and I experience. The gospel is not gospel and me. It's not Jesus and me. It's not God and me. It's God and we. It's an us thing. In fact, if you think about it, you really can't do this command. You can't obey this command outside of community. You can't love one another unless there's another to love. And so I want to challenge you a lot on this one because I think we take a pass on this way too quickly. And when we take a pass on this, we take a step away from Jesus. And when we take a step away from Jesus, we're no longer walking with him. He's not walking with us. And that's a dangerous place to be. Because our goal is to be connected to the heart of God. Our goal is to be fruitful, not to have inner peace. It's to be fruitful, not to have inner peace. In fact, there's some beautiful branches on the vine that Jesus references that are going to be cut off because there's no fruit on them. And so this fruitfulness is something we need to take very seriously. And don't take that as some kind of crazy threat. Take it more as oh, wow, I'm missing the point here. here I was thinking this whole thing was about inner peace, and I'm feeling pretty good about my inner peace, and I'm doing meditation all the time, and yet I'm not really showing much of that in terms of the way that I know how to love people in a Jesus kind of way, which is enriching for us and everybody else. So I want to tell you about a story about a guy I know that if you were to have a conversation with him, you are going to find out very quickly that this guy is a very serious Christian. And before too long, he's going to be talking about the Bible with you and Bible stories and letting you know just how much of the Bible he knows. And he knows a lot. He can quote chapter and verse like nobody's business. He's probably studied the thing cover to cover for literally decades. He's now in his 90s. He doesn't live around here. And I've known this guy for some time, known about this guy for many, many years. He's kind of a fascinating character study. This guy's gone to church for most of his adult life, if not his entire life, because he grew up in a Christian home. Like I said, he studies the Bible diligently. He can talk theology pretty well. He's got a pretty tight theology that he lives his life by. But there's a very odd thing about this man that I think John 15 in this passage speaks into. There's a part that's missing, and it's tragic, and it's painful, and it's sad. Somewhere along the line, a few decades ago, several decades ago, one of this man's children, he has many children, and one of this man's children, his son, came out of the closet. And he let his parents know, who were conservative Christians, that he was gay. And as soon as he came out of the closet, his father showed him the door and locked it behind him and told him that if you come back gay, you're not coming back in. And the guy took him at his word. And we don't even know where he lives anymore. We think he lives in Palm Springs somewhere, but he hasn't had contact with his own parents for decades. Completely estranged from his family because his dad didn't know how to love. And that's not the only kid that's estranged from the father. There's another child, one of his daughters, who they got into a theological argument about. And one thing about this guy, after about 5 minutes of conversation, you'll know, is that he is very strong in his opinions. And there's no discussion. It's his way is right. And if you don't agree with him, then there's no more to talk about. And so we'll just stop talking. And that's exactly what happened. Somewhere along the way, an argument happened over a theological perspective, and he and his daughter disagreed, and so he stopped talking to his daughter. What is going on? And I'm thinking, this is tragic and needs to be a cautionary tale, but also informative for us. Because what this tells me is you can spend your whole life memorizing and studying the Bible, even attending church, and yet miss this point. And I think it's because there's a difference between attending church and reading the Bible and being in community and learning to love one another. Learning to love one another means that we recognize we don't know all the answers, and we have a lot to learn about how to love, and we do. It means that there may be things in our character that other people are loving into us even though. And finding out what those things are about us, our own character growth areas, if you will, that takes love on somebody else's part to point out to us, and it requires love on our part to hear. And when we choose to love people who are in tough spaces in their life where things are difficult, they are often as prickly as cactuses and are very difficult to love. And yet, Jesus did it, and it was a part of the redemption process of the people that were loved, of himself, and of the world. And so don't be like that guy, because it's just like, when I think about that guy, I'm like, man, you know so much, and yet you've missed it all. You've totally missed the point. So I just wish I could shake him, and other people have tried, and to no avail. And I just think, man, the guy is going. I mean, I don't want to think weird thoughts, but I just think he's going to go in through the gates of heaven with such a prideful arrogance of having arrived because of all the wonderful Christian things he's done. And I just have a hunch that, if we can kind of picture it this way, that Jesus is going to give him that welcome hug, but then just kind of weep with him and say, but man, if only you would have known how big and expansive and inclusive my love is. Things could have been different with your son. And how much more lovely that could have been, not just for you two, but for the statement that makes to the whole world. So this love one another stuff is Jesus' love. This is really important. And if you call yourself spiritual, this is a part of that, is to be invested in community with other people who are helping you learn to love, because you can't learn to love all by your lonesome. Which leads me to another example, a much more positive example. This man's name was Nicholas Herman, and he lived in the late 1400s, not long before the Reformation, and died just before that happened, actually, but certainly heard rumblings of it and lived through an expression of the Reformation before the Reformation. And anyway, this guy grew up very, very poor, joined the French army at a young age because you were guaranteed some meals and a small amount of pay, fought in a battle, got injured, and needed to do something else with his life. And so he was deeply spiritual, joined a Catholic monastery in Paris, a Carmelite monastery, and became a brother. And Nicholas was a klutz by his own admission, and which is kind of funny because before he was in the monastery, he was a valet or a valet, as the English might say, and would help people with their stuff. And being a klutz got into trouble all the time. And when he went into the monastery, he became a cook and was a klutz in the kitchen all the time and felt kind of awkward about it, bad about it. But nobody said anything about it because they wanted to eat, I guess. I'm not quite sure. But anyway, this guy, in his passionate pursuit of God, came across an interesting discovery. And this kind of ties all this John 15 stuff together. He's in a monastery, which means they have a regular order of their days and how things are going to operate and when things start and when things end. And you go to chapel and you go to your prayer services and you do your study and all this stuff. But you know what he discovered? He discovered that he felt closer to the presence of God while he was peeling potatoes and washing dishes than when he was in the chapel service. And he goes on, he says, I felt closer to the presence of God when I was walking in the woods than I would in our regimented prayer times with all of our liturgy. He felt closer to the presence of God when he was out and about just doing his normal life than when he was listening to new Bible study. So he came up with a mantra, and he even wrote a little book about this called Practicing the Presence of God. Now, many of you don't know the name Nicholas Herman so well, but you might know the name Brother Lawrence, and that's who we're talking about, a man who learned to practice the presence of God. Now, the problem is sometimes when we hear about what he had to say, which is beautiful, the whole idea is he really bought into this truth that God is with us everywhere, and therefore God is accessible everywhere, and we can converse with God, and it's both ways. There's a dialogue that can happen everywhere all the time that we go. And so we listen and we read Practicing the Presence of God, which is a great writing. There's a new rendition of it called Closer Than a Brother that you can find. It's written maybe in the 1980s, early 90s, something like that. Really good, kind of a modern adaptation, and really enriching. Here's the problem. When we read this as American Christians, we think, oh, practicing the presence of God, fantastic. I can do that all by myself on a walk in the woods. And you can practice the presence of God, and you can talk to God while you're in the woods and doing dishes and peeling potatoes. But don't forget that Brother Lawrence was a brother in a monastery, a Carmelite monastery in Paris. In other words, he did not divorce his spirituality from community. In fact, it was his community that helped foster his understanding, that enabled him to practice the presence of God in the first place. It was his community around him that allowed him to speak freely and clearly in ways that were fresh and new in a time where Catholicism had grown rigid. It was because of his community that he formed his thoughts even more and more deeply. It was because of his community that more people understood what he had to say and welcomed them in there and even wrote his ideas down. So that's actually, Brother Lawrence, is why I'm in this workspace today, because this is one of our food pantry storage rooms where we store our food before we get ready for our big distribution. And what this room represents is more than food storage, because it represents also a bunch of brother and sister Lawrences at Crosswalk Church and a range of people from the community. Because there's a group of people, our food pantry team, that are learning the power of how the whole thing works together once a month, where you have a group of people that come together because of their love for God. They're wanting to serve, they're wanting to love the community, but they also love each other and have a great time together. And they come together in a loving, graceful way, these things sounding familiar, I hope, all so that they can be the incarnate presence of God with people who need food in the community. And you've seen pictures, we've promoted these things around, but this is Brother Lawrence stuff in action, and it's beautiful. And I'm wondering how your connection is with God. And I'm wondering if you're not on the food pantry. If you're on the food pantry, I'm not too worried about you, because I know that you're connected to community, and I know that you're connected to love, and I know that you're being fostered in really healthful ways. And if you're connected in other things, then I'm not too worried about you, because I know those things kind of foster the whole thing along. But I am worried about you if you're not connected in community, and if you've bought into this idea of a radically individualized spirituality. I think you'll get inner peace. I think that can happen. But I'm not so sure that some of the other deeper, richer experiences of life which require community are going to happen for you. And you get to do this community thing. You get to go deeper with the presence of God. And so I'm inviting you to consider that today. How might you take what Jesus had to say about being connected to the vine, connected to each other, connected to Jesus, following in his footsteps in different ways, choosing to love one another in the ways that Jesus loved? How might you integrate that into your life? I hope you will. I hope you'll recognize that you have stuff to learn even about love. Even if you think you're a very loving person, the love of Jesus is deep and profound and completely self-sacrificial. What does that look like in the way we live our lives? Why not come to a community group and find out just what that could look like? Thanks for coming today. I hope you've had a good experience, and I look forward to seeing you on my return next Sunday. Thanks a lot.